Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here to Eager Beaver Outdoors. I'm your host, Anthony, and today we really have a fun one because we're delving back into the realm of American history. More particular, we're going into small-town American history. Where we are today, again, is beautiful Mattoon, Illinois, a place that, typical of most Midwestern towns, is largely forgotten about by the larger world. And yet its impact on the world of the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, both world wars, and world history is really something that shouldn't be forgotten about. So today, we're going to be looking at the last 100 years of this town to see how it's progressed, how it's changed, and how this little town happens to reflect the greater changes in the American nation as a whole. Get ready to come along on a fun one, boys and girls. Beautiful Mattoon, Illinois is known for many wonders of life, including corn, soybeans, and abandoned industries. However, that doesn't mean that's the entire story of Mattoon. In fact, 100 years ago, this was a very different town, and we're going to take a very studious approach to our research here. In fact, we're going to one of the most preeminent locations you possibly could for understanding the entire history of this beautiful little town. Here at the Mattoon Public Library, we have an incredibly exciting meeting with the head of the local history museum. Best of all, this museum is entirely free, and all you have to do is take a ride down to the basement to find it. I would just like to say before we get into the overall interview that this museum is ridiculously large and ridiculously extensive, especially for a museum that is dedicated to local history. I make no exaggeration when I tell you that there are tens of thousands of original documents and artifacts relating to the time before the American Civil War to the modern day and age. It really is impressive, and I highly encourage you to come visit. But now, let's go to the man of the hour who's taking us on this tour through history. Boys and girls, here before you is Mr. Chris Suerdieck.
I'm Chris Suerdieck, and I am the volunteer curator of the local history center, which is located in the Mattoon Public Library in Mattoon, Illinois. And we are a historic 1903 Carnegie library. And over the course of the last 6 years since I've been retired, I have created a museum on the history of Mattoon. Then we take up almost the entire basement and a good portion of another floor.
From here, Chris is going to take us on a walkthrough through Mattoon, Illinois' history and key areas. Starting off here, we're going to look at the historic Grant Hotel.
The Grant Hotel was established, was built and opened in 1928. And the significance of it was, for a town the size of Mattoon, it had all of the conveniences and all the ambiance of a much larger city. In fact, it was recognized to be quite an unusual facility in a town this size. So it was quite an imposing building for its time. The building is still there. It's multi-floor. It had very upgraded rooms. It had a recognized dining room that people came from all over. I think it actually made the Duncan Hines list of restaurants to visit when you're traveling. And the cocktail lounge became known as the Rebel Room, and it was known as the hangout in Mattoon for all the movers and the shakers. And it's been said that more business deals were done in the cocktail lounge at the U.S. Grant Hotel than any place else in Mattoon.
We are now going to shift our focus over to the railroad history of Mattoon, Illinois, because it is deeply reflective of what happened to the entire United States and its industrialization and, in time, its de-industrialization.
Well, the Illinois Central Railroad passenger depot that's still in existence in Mattoon was built in about 1916. I believe it opened in January of 1918. It was a result of a major project that the Illinois Central undertook here in Mattoon, and for its time, it was very advanced. It was one of the most ornate passenger depots on the Illinois Central for a city of this size. and it had 3 floors because since the tracks were lowered, the boarding floor level was actually down in the subway. So you go in on Broadway at ground level, and then went down 2 flights to board, 2 floors to board the trains. After passenger service really kind of fell out of favor, and eventually Amtrak took over passenger service, and Amtrak still runs through Mattoon and used that depot, but it had fallen into disuse and disrepair. And sometime around probably about 2000, the railroad actually deeded the building to the city, and after a fundraiser, the building was completely restored and rehabilitated, and still functions today as the Amtrak station. Mattoon was actually founded when the 2 railroads came through here. What became known as the Big Four Railroad, which was the East-West Railroad. And in the early days when they came to Mattoon, they established a roundhouse and shops out at the 10th Street and Richmond Avenue. And so those shops, during the heyday, that was a major point for the Big Four Railroad between Indianapolis and St. Louis and Kansas City. So the shops in Mattoon in their heyday employed about 700 men. I mean, it was a full-fledged locomotive repair center. They could overhaul the steam engines. They had a large roundhouse, and it was a very important factor in early Mattoon. And part of the reason for employing so many people is in those days, the steam locomotives just took an immense amount of maintenance, and you had all the different specialists, the boilermen, the welders, the blacksmiths, the painters, the carpenters, the welders. Every trade was employed by the railroads to take care of service and repair not only the locomotives, but they could also repair cars. They had both sets of shops had full-fledged woodworking shops. They had paint shops where they would repaint cars. And they were really the major industry in Mattoon for many, many, many years.
In this modern day and age, it might seem hard to believe, but indeed, yes, there were men who delivered milk to your door back in the day of days. And for Mattoon, Illinois, that happened to come from the Meadow Creamery, as can be seen here.
The Meadow Dairy, and that's a very interesting story too. So Mattoon, like all small towns, or really any town in the United States before the days of refrigeration and transportation, had local dairies. And so Beatrice Foods, which was the parent corporation of Meadow, came to Mattoon in 1928. And in about 1935, they built the building that was at the corner of 14th and Broadway in Mattoon. And during that time period, they purchased several smaller dairies. And the primary dairy here in Mattoon that they purchased and took over was the Mattoon Ice Cream and Dairy. And so they took that business over. And one reason they took it over is because they wanted the ice cream plant. So in the days here in Mattoon, they actually, besides processing milk itself, they produced ice cream and cottage cheese. One of the things that I found interesting is a lot of the small dairies in Mattoon that did door-to-door delivery. In, I believe it was 1933, Illinois, the state of Illinois passed a law that said you cannot sell unpasteurized milk. So because of that, many of the small local dairies closed up and went out of business. And a lot of the farmers that had furnished milk to either those small dairies or marketed milk themselves then started selling bulk milk to the Meadow dairy plant here in Mattoon. So the plant here in Mattoon serviced a wide area, probably 8 to 10 counties in this part of the state. The closest other Meadow plant was in Champaign. And eventually in 1981, when Meadow decided to close the plant here, the distribution was transferred to their plant in Champaign.
Now, let's go back to the classic era of American cruising culture, and here in this empty lot is what used to be the Gill's Drive-In, a place with some fairly interesting history related to a modern chain you might all recognize.
So Harold and Ruth Gill both worked for Gus Belt, who started Steak and Shake in Bloomington, Illinois in about 1932-33, I'm not sure the exact year. They were some of his earliest employees, and as a couple, they would travel, and they were the ones that would go, when he started expanding, they would go to other towns and actually get the restaurant started, hire and train the help, and then move on and open another restaurant. And after many years of doing that, they really kind of had gotten burned out on traveling and moving around all the time, and they were wanting to start a family. And so they went to Mr. Belt and they told him, that they wanted to go start their own restaurant. And since they had been so in-depth engaged in the operation of how Steak and Shake worked, they really kind of wanted to copy that business model. Unofficially, the word I've had from family members is that they had an unofficial arrangement with Gus Belt, promised them that he would never open a Steak and Shake in Mattoon as long as they were in business. So in 1949, they came to Mattoon and completely remodeled the restaurant. And actually, in the early days, it looked just exactly like a Steak and Shake. They even had the same white building with black lettering, and it was called Gill's Drive-In. And over the years, it just became a teen hangout. And they did have really good food, and they were known especially, for their hamburgers and their chili mac. And we would drive down Broadway and turn north on 12th Street, drive through Gill's parking lot, see who was there, because it was all car service. So, just like American Graffiti, you had people parked in the parking lot with the aluminum trays on their windowsill. And it just became the go-to place, and it lasted. When the Gills decided to retire, they sold it to a fellow named Paul Farr, who continued to operate it for several years. And then after he sold it, it kind of started going downhill. They didn't keep up the quality. They didn't keep up the Gill's attention to detail. And it eventually just turned into another greasy spoon and eventually closed, sadly. But it's very high in the memory banks of a lot of generations of Mattoon kids.
Something that is often forgotten when it comes to small town history is that Coca-Cola used to be bottled in your local town, and it was no different here for Mattoon, Illinois, which proudly had one of the best Coca-Cola plants this side of the Mississippi.
The Coca-Cola plant in Mattoon started in Mattoon in 1905 as the Union Bottling Works. And of course, again, back in those days, having a place that would sell locally produced soda, pop, whatever you want to call it, and they had a multitude of different flavors. And in 1928, William F. Cull, who had a Coca-Cola bottling plant in Murfreesboro, Illinois, found out that the one in Mattoon was for sale, so he purchased it. So in about 1930, I believe, he purchased the building the building is still there at the corner of 21st and Prairie Avenue. And it had been a machine shop, and he moved the bottling plant there. And then in about 1950, he enlarged the building and completely remodeled it and put the front on the building that's there now. One of the hallmarks of that building was there were two large plate glass windows, so you could stand outside and watch the bottling, and you could watch the bottles of Coke spin by in the bottling machine through those plate glass windows. One of the other interesting things about the Cull Coca-Cola bottling plant is over the course of years, Coca-Cola started, they started really going to the large multi-state bottlers and distribution. And Mattoon's privately owned Coca-Cola plant was one of the last privately owned and operated bottling plants in the Coca-Cola system. And somewhere, I don't know the year for sure, but at some point they did convert to canning rather than bottling. And in, I think it was 1975, somewhere in there, I think it was an anniversary for Coca-Cola. As part of their anniversary, they came back out with a 6-ounce glass bottle. Mattoon was one of 8 cities in the United States that they commemorated with a bottle stamped with Mattoon, Illinois on it. in honor of the Cull Bottling Company and the Mattoon plant.
Before You Hear Now is one of the greatest institutions to exist within Mattoon, Illinois. Since 1954, Burger King has been the pinnacle of Mattoon society, and it's infinitely better, and it's the original compared to that other Burger King. Here we have something that holds all of life together, served to you in a greasy bag. And for anyone who tells you that this is just a cheeseburger, you can tell them that they're just an idiot. This is also the only place in America that I'm aware of where they serve you ice cream that appears to be sentient, and then from there you can proceed to eat its face off. Nice. From here, let's discuss the history of the original Burger King and one of the greatest court cases to ever take place regarding copyright laws.
The original Burger King, and that's another very interesting story. The Burger King actually started as the Frigid Queen. In 1952, Gene Hoots purchased a freestanding soft-serve ice cream stand, which was called the Frigid Queen, and it had been operated for a couple of years before by another person, and Gene bought it to operate. And the Frigid Queen was actually, like I said, it was a freestanding metal building that was a Valentine manufacturing building, and the name Frigid Queen actually went with the ice cream stand. So it wasn't a franchise, but there were other Frigid Queens in other areas. Where his location was, he was right across the street from where the operators for the Illinois Consolidated Telephone Company worked, and they would come over on their breaks and get ice cream, and a lot of them started asking if he would make them sandwiches for lunch. So he originally just put a small grill and a deep fryer in the ice cream stand and started making hamburgers and French fries. A couple of years later, the building on the same lot, Schudel's Dry Cleaners, they closed up their plant, and so he was able to lease that building and then put in a full-fledged hamburger stand. And in order to kind of capitalize on, he already had the name Frigid Queen, so he named the hamburger stand the Burger King. So they actually started as a standalone business in about 1954 and just continued to grow. And the interesting part about this, and it's again part of the Mattoon urban legend, is in the 60s, the Burger King chain that had been started in Tampa, Florida, began to expand, and they opened their first store in Skokie, Illinois. Well, in about 1965, 66, somewhere in there, they opened a store in Champaign, Illinois. And so Gene decided that was getting too close for comfort, and he had the foresight to register the Burger King name in the state of Illinois back in the early 50s. So he basically sued them for using the name because he had the name registered in the state of Illinois. They had not done their due diligence and didn't realize that he was in business in Mattoon. And at that time, they actually had not registered their name nationally. So they got their name registered nationally and then countersued him. It went to district court in Danville, and the district court in Danville, Illinois in 1968 ruled that because he had registered the name in Illinois first, and that the Burger King chain registered the name secondarily, they did not have first rights to the name in the state of Illinois. And so as a settlement, they let Gene Hoots and his wife Betty keep the name in Mattoon, but since they had never had any plans to expand outside of this area, the final settlement was that the Burger King chain was not allowed to open a restaurant within a 25-mile radius of Mattoon. And that injunction holds to this day.
Here in what is now an empty and abandoned lot was formerly one of the greatest production plants of the Second World War. Let's learn about it now.
Atlas Imperial Diesel is another very interesting story. The Atlas Imperial Diesel company manufactured diesel engines of all different sizes and for all different types of operations. And their home plant was in Oakland, California. So the Atlas Imperial Diesel company, rather than having to ship train carloads of diesel engines out to the Midwest, they decided to locate a plant somewhere in the Midwest. So Atlas Diesel moved here in 1935 and began fulfilling all of their orders for the Midwest out of the Mattoon plant. What was interesting about this is when World War II came about, the Atlas plant continued to build diesel engines primarily for the Navy and for the shipbuilding industry, but they converted part of their plant to manufacture 155 millimeter artillery projectiles for the Army. At the height of their production, they were producing 40,000 shells a month for the military. One of the things that they were awarded 3 Army Navy E for Excellent banners for meeting and exceeding their production and quality quotas. So they contributed directly to the war effort, both in manufacturing the artillery shells and in manufacturing and supplying diesel engines for military use. After the war, they continued to produce diesel engines, but they closed the Mattoon plant and shipped their production equipment back to the home plant in Oakland, California.
Here at Friendship Park is where we're going to be ending our discussion of Mattoon, Illinois. And this town, I can tell you, over its over 150 years of life, has been through some incredible events. Really, how much it's changed is so reflective of how America itself has changed, going from the likes of an agricultural society into that of manufacturing, and eventually seeing so many of those jobs go away and the supporting industry disappearing with it. Yet, at the same time, we see this town, like so much of the United States, also coming back with new industries, new shopping outlets, and people, just like before, trying their best to live their lives. This town has given me, since my childhood, a love of history and a love of the United States. Further, being able to talk with so many people who are so fascinated to see with where this town came from and where it's going is so humbling. We'd like to thank those at the Mattoon Library, including Chris, for their help in all of this. And now, I have to leave you all. If you've enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. Further, if you want to follow our adventures a little more closely, utilize the Instagram below. Most of all, we thank the people of Mattoon, Illinois for the opportunity once more to explore the beauty of America's heartland. We thank you all, and until next time, this is the Eager Beaver crew signing off.